This is Chthonia, the world of the dark feminine. Hello and welcome to Chthonia, the podcast dealing with the dark feminine. I'm your host, Breach Burke. Now this week we are continuing the series on the Navadurgas, and this week we are talking about Katyayani. Now Katyayani is the sixth Navadurga, and she is considered to be one of the fiercest of the Navadurgas that we've looked at so far. We've looked at all of these different manifestations of goddess Parvati, and Katyayani is another aspect of that. And again, depending on the scripture that you're reading and on the tradition that you're coming from, we see a slightly different inflection. So in Amarakosha, she's referred to as another version of the goddess Adi Parashakti, which we talked about the last time with Skandamata. And so again, this is another aspect of Parvati as an incarnation of Shakti. And when I say incarnation, I mean the form that she takes as a deity. In Shaktism, it said she's associated with the fierce forms of Shakti or of Durga, which makes sense because she's one of the Navadurgas, and that also includes Bhadrakali and also Chandika. Okay, these are the angry forms. Anger is really the key word that we have here for Katyayani, and she is. It's mentioned that she is created out of the spontaneous anger of the gods. So what I would like to do here is talk about, first of all, describe what she is supposed to look like, okay, what her attributes are. Then we're going to go into what her origin story is and the different stories and practices associated with Katyayani. And then we're going to look more closely at some of those associations, the association of her with the Ajna chakra, which is the third eye, and also the meaning of some very contradictory aspects of her, because while we see her in this very violent and destructive and angry form, there's also an aspect of her that has to do with having a happy marriage or finding the appropriate mate. And you think, how in the world do these two things go together? Of course, if you've been married, you might, the idea of manifestations of anger may not be such a foreign concept there. But in theory, if you think about marriage as being, ideally marriage being a compatibility between people, not necessarily people who won't fight, but people who, generally speaking, enjoy being together, like being in each other's company. Although again, after you've been married a certain period of time, sometimes you don't quite feel that way. It's hoped in an ideal world that you would, for the most part, feel that way. That your spouse is somebody you would want to be with. So okay, so we have these different things, but I want to talk a little bit about again her attributes, and then these other the stories. And then what we can sort of piece together from that. Okay, so she is described as being, let me see, I have a description here. She is, depicted with 4, 10, or 18 hands. She's associated with the color red. Let's see, I have another, it's not the one I'm looking at. Okay, she's got 3 eyes, 18 arms, flowing black hair, and resplendent. She is armed to the teeth. Okay, the Tridevi, the Tridevas, Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva, and also many of the other deities like Agni, Lord of Fire, and many of the other gods, arm her basically to the teeth. It says she's armed her with trident, discus, conch, dart, sword, shield, bows and arrows, a thunderbolt from Indra, mace and battle axe, and also with the mala, the rosary, and the water pot. Okay. And of course, she is mounted on a lion. Now, Katyayani is the form of Durga that we most commonly see represented for all of Navaratri. Okay. It's an image of Durga, and if you're watching the video, you will definitely probably see multiple versions of this image. And the way that they're done and their varying intensity, I find interesting. generally you see this very sweet and beautiful looking woman who's carrying this, who's just, got all these arms with all these weapons. And she's looking down, like almost with this sort of like motherly, loving compassion as there's a man on the ground who is actually the Mahisasura. Sometimes he's shown as half of a buffalo or an ox because he's the, because his, the name that he has actually has to do with wild ox. And that's a form that he is able to take. Mahisasura also implies like the idea Mahi is as we know, like Maha. It's the Sanskrit for great. Okay, and Ashura, of course, is these beings that we tend to translate as demons. Basically, they're just these very adharmic, often forces that once they get out of control, they become adharmic. Okay, they are outside of the what the established order or the established roles that are prescribed for the preservation of the universe as it is. Okay, so the gods these Ashuras tend to engage very heavily in Dharma, which is why eventually they are either destroyed in battle, and of course when they're destroyed they rise again because these kinds of things never entirely go away. It's not it's a mistake, as I've always said, to look at these as a strict battle between good and evil. So Mahisasura is considered to be, at this point, the king of the Ashuras, the Mahisasura, right? And he has, at least in this version, there's a couple of different versions in the Devi Mahatmyam, but the idea is that he has conquered the three worlds. Now, one of the stories of Katyayani is one that I've already said in other podcasts, so I'll probably, when I repeat it here, it will only be briefly. Let's just talk about her incarnation first. Okay, so this is from the Vamana Purana. It says, at once a number of demons performed penance for pleasing the gods and obtaining boons. Mahisasura was chief among them. He had the face of a buffalo, and already possessed tremendous strength. He did severe penance to Lord Brahma, and got from him various boons, which made him almost unconquerable. The most important of these that he obtained assured him that if all he was killed, that it can only be by a woman. Okay, because obviously, them ladies don't do any fighting, right? No. Well, it's and to have asked for that kind of a boon shows here the absolute absence of any kind of knowledge about Shakti or how Shakti works, because what the gods know is that their strength comes from the feminine, from this feminine power that often manifests as a female deity. So Mahisasura, fully armed with many blessings and well protected by boons, went on the rampage and played havoc on heaven and earth, or in the three worlds really, committing unspeakable atrocities against the devas and human beings. The ultimate gods, Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva, decided to put an end to it, and they together emitted a massive flame, from which emerged Devi Katyayani, with the brilliance of innumerable suns. With 3 eyes, okay, just explained that description of her. When the heavenly beings bowed to her, the gods armed her with fully powerful weapons. She then proceeded straight on her lion mount, along with her army, to take on Mahisasura. Okay, so she is, and there is, now I went through my copy of the Chandipat because I know that this story is told there. However, the story is really, really, really long, and written in kind of a form that's more like a prayer or a chant. So I thought, okay, the summary is probably good enough for our purposes. Now, as far as how she was born, she's regarded as the daughter of the sage Katyayana, which is where she gets her name from. He was a rishi. He was born in the Katya dynasty, originated from the rishi Vishwamitra. So her name became Katyayani as the daughter of Katyayana. He had prayed that Durga. He was a devout Shakti devotee, and he wanted the Devi to, he wanted Durga to be born as his daughter, basically. And so this is the form that she ends up taking. Now, when she is created, yes, it comes from the Tridevas, the Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva, but we also hear that she was armed, there's a lot of the other gods, major gods, who have also armed her in this battle. And so what happens here is she goes to fight Mahisasura. It says, however, bowled over by her dazzling beauty, the demon, instead of engaging her in battle, simply asked for her hand in marriage. And again, this is the story that I've told, where he sends an emissary, and the emissary tells her, how wonderful he is, and how you're nothing compared to him. And But the goddess just smiles. As we all know, that the smile of the goddess brings about quite a lot of activity, or a lot of creates a lot of. It can literally be creative in the sense of creating the world, or it can just it's always a sign of something very very potent. And she told him that he had to win her over first. And in other words, when they say that, it means you have to defeat me in battle. So I've told this story where they come and they say, oh, yes, he's so wonderful, and you're just some stupid woman. And she just goes, oh, yeah, yeah, well, She goes, well, yeah, it's true, but, the way that it's described in Chandipat, she would say, but I've made this promise without thinking, that no man can have me unless they defeat me in battle. So, sorry, he's going to just have to come and fight with me if he wants to have my hand. And they said, what, are you crazy? You're just some woman. You're this, you're that. And she goes, yeah, I know. I'm just some stupid woman. But, what can I do? I've made this promise. And so of course, he thinks this is just ridiculous. And he sends out, I think, the demons of passion and anger are the first two to confront her. And the battle royale begins that we see, and which the Chandipat describes in full gory detail, and is described to some level in the Mahisasura Madini Stotra, which is, again, something not very easily translatable into English, but when you do translate it, it's really, it's pretty violent. It's pretty graphic too, about braining the enemies, the elephants' mounts that they rode on, ripping the guts out of this one and doing that one. I mean, it's a pretty violent affair of the way that the Devi takes on the legions of armies of the Mahisasura, and then finally she takes on the Mahisasura himself. And because he takes on the form of a buffalo or this wild ox, I've seen it translated both ways. He becomes a bit slippery, a bit difficult for her to pin down, but then she tricks him and lands on his back. And then she's able to, drive her trident into him, and then she chops his head off. So she ends up killing him that way. Now, there's another story associated with her. And this, of course, by the way, is the whole purpose of Navaratri in a way. It's this whole focus on this Devi that gets rid of these forces that are considered to be adharmic. When the Vishnu is as a deity is the great preserver, as I've mentioned. And as the great preserver, when these kinds of things happen, when there are things that are going to potentially disrupt, unbalance, and destroy, or at least cause a tremendous amount of suffering, when there's atrocities that are being committed, then Vishnu is to step in to preserve what is dharmic, because Dharma is like that foundation that things are set on. Now, you can argue about the meaning of Dharma. We may talk about that in kind of a modern setting, like what is the role of Dharma? There's almost something, if you know anything about Confucianism, there's very similarity in the idea that by playing your proper role, that you preserve the harmony of the world, of the universe, and so on and so forth. And of course, in India, that has a lot to do with caste, like what caste you're born into, what your role is supposed to be. Now, from a social perspective, that has the potential to be extremely problematic, because in our more sort of democratic way of Western thinking, there's certain people, like, for example, the outcasts, that we feel that often are very much mistreated, by the basis of, well, you're born into this caste, so obviously, it's karmically, there's something you've done to put you into this caste. And this is a way of thinking that we don't like and that we don't accept in sort of Western democratic ways of thinking. And and I'm not actually defending that way of thinking. And this is one case where I'm kind of like, yeah, I'm actually kind of on the Western democratic side here. I don't think people should be, treated in that fashion. But but again, that's an argument that is often made. And I know my guru is someone who very early on spent her time, bringing food and things to the outcasts, and her parents were, of course, outraged because, how could you go and spend any time around these people, but because she's going beyond the role of caste in doing that. And like any institution, one has to question the validity of it in this day and age, at least that aspect of it. There may be other aspects of the caste system which are, which might be useful or helpful in defining a role or a guide. But socially speaking, it's problematic in a lot. In fact, there's something almost adharmic about the Dharma. It's weird, from that perspective, because I don't think that the lesson in restoring order is by, crapping on certain people just because of, what family they were born in, So anyway, that's the whole thing about that. Nonetheless, Dharma goes beyond, just whatever the traditions of the caste system are. Dharma has to do with just what constitutes right action. Like what is the proper thing for you to do in any particular situation. It involves using discrimination, and not in the sense of I'm going to discriminate against this person in a negative sense, but rather I'm going to learn to discriminate or to separate out what constitutes, correct action in a particular situation, whatever that is, rather than attaching a label of right or wrong. Frequently, what you will see is that these good and bad, right and wrong labels, you'll see them in a lot of the scriptures, in all the religions, including Hinduism. And the way that it's generally understood is that most people are not on an intense spiritual. They're not on an intense like tantric path, for example. They're not on an intense, not everybody is aiming for that level of depth and enlightenment and knowledge. Most people are just kind of, they're born here. They want to get on. They want to do, work in a field that interests them. They may want to have families. They may want to have children. They may want to, live what you would consider to be kind of a normal, mundane, ordinary life, and have everything that you need, have prosperity within that, right? It's the people who want to go, and so the rules are really made for that, to preserve that kind of prosperous society. And, and to allow one to have, enjoyment of life in that way. And the idea usually in Hinduism is that towards the end of life, when one has had their family and they've had, they've worked, they've made their money, they've had their children and all that, this is the point at which then they should turn their attention to spiritual matters and to perhaps withdrawing from the world and withdrawing from life. Okay, so this is what's being kind of this kind of cycle of things that's sought to be preserved. When you get into things like Tantra, okay, and when you get into now Tantra, first of all, is largely reviled in India. I don't want to say entirely. There's people who do understand something about what it is, but Tantra is often, for one thing, Tantra, at least the aspect of Tantra that has to do with siddhis or power, is something that's often embraced by the lower castes or by the outcasts. Okay, like there's a it's the quote unquote black magic side of it, and mind you, I'm not implying therefore that all Tantra is black magic, because I'm not. It's just simply that siddhis or powers could be used in that way. In a way, it's almost like what happens with these Ashuric beings who, ask for these boons, and then when they get these great powers, they do, very destructive. Well, even, they do things with them that end up causing disruption and pain for a lot of people. Okay, so it's not. So the idea is that, it's not just about having power. Okay, that this can be, like a lot of things, it can be intoxicating and can make you do things or make you feel, that's when your rationality, when your ego, when everything else gets blown up and you start to think that somehow you are superior, or that you are, you are some kind of superior, invincible being in your own right. And that, and then it becomes all about you. And it's not about what your role is in the world, in society, in being compassionate, in being in harmony with nature, and being with, all of these things. It becomes entirely about, gratifying the beast of your own ego. So, this is, why there's very, very strong strictures around Dharma. So, but people who get involved with things that kind of go beyond what we think of as the normal rules of what is espoused as Dharma. For one thing, I think there's a social implication to it, especially when you're dealing with people of the lower castes who might use that as a means of getting some kind of power. When I'm talking about some of the, Caribbean or South American or, even Afro-Caribbean kind of deities, and I always seem to get into trouble with this with people. So, it just, take this as a social statement and not as anything else. But the people who are very drawn to a deity like Pambagira, for instance, or who are drawn to Santa Muerte, or drawn to these other kinds of deities that that tend to be associated, like Santa Muerte in particular, as we've said, tends to be associated with whether fairly or not, with criminality, with drug rings, with things like that. She's put forward as a Catholic saint, but the Catholic Church says no, she's not a saint. But those who are devoted to her, of course, know better. But oftentimes it may be people who are very poor or who are very oppressed in some fashion who may turn to these figures because these figures give them some kind of dignity. Okay, there's some kind of integrity or dignity that comes out of this, whether it be about power or not. There's a lot of people who try to say, oh, it's about power. And it may be for some people. That's always a possibility. That's always a trapping. But it's not ultimately, this is something that, it's the power that one has in the sense of almost an empowerment. Now, again, I don't mean it to sound like that word is thrown around so much these days in a way that is, sometimes is just tiresome. But people who do feel, this is not like the fake self-esteem thing. People who just feel like they have no voice and no say in society, this may be the method or the means by which they're actually able to gain that kind of a voice or gain some kind of an influence. Okay. So, for me to call any of that, selfish or that, no, this is just a way in which one, wants to get on with them, for themselves in a world when they are at a severe disadvantage. Okay. So that's certainly an aspect of things. No, that's not the whole story on those deities, but that's certainly an aspect. Other aspects of Tantra, nonetheless, when you really get into Tantra, into the Tantric goddesses, which I've already done in the whole series on the Mahavidyas and on the Matrikas, when you really get into the qualities of these particular deities, they are they move outside those social norms. So, for example, if we're talking about purity and the idea of purity and purification as part of, regular sacred ritual to the deities, then you have a deity like Matangi, who is about, pollution and filth. It's this idea that, okay, we have these dharmic rules, but there's a reality beyond these dharmic rules that, I'll use the word transcends all of them. That basically, it goes beyond those rules. It's no longer about that. It's kind of like you move into a space where there's almost a natural sense of discrimination that takes over rather than I must follow this rule or that rule. Okay. So I'm sorry, that's kind of a long way around of talking about this kind of thing. But when we talk about Dharma and adharma, and we're talking about a situation that's adharmic, you're talking about something that is broadly destructive for a large group of people in this case. And represents when somebody takes these things and makes them, that is not a person who has moved beyond those categories. They're not, people who practice Tantra are not necessarily quote unquote evil people, but there is a kind of a knowledge there that, these judgments we make about, what is socially acceptable, what is moral, what is good, what is bad. There's a reality that's beyond that. Okay. I think that's maybe the easiest way to say it. So, nonetheless, this has a lot to do with balancing. This particular battle with the Mahisasura is also known as the battle between too much and too little. It's when we fall on either side. We either become so arrogant and inflated with ourselves that we, again, there's that selfishness, or we're just so filled. There's the opposite. And I've talked about this before, the self-depreciation where, oh, I'm just a victim. I'm this, I'm that, and that is equally irritating and potentially equally destructive. Because then two things tend to happen with a person like that. One, because they are so debasing of themselves and perhaps what their own actual talents and abilities are, they just become very, very toxic rather than using whatever natural abilities or gifts or, whatever you want to call them, not using them appropriately. The other, which would be adharmic, right? The other piece of it is that then that person becomes almost a kind of a parasite, or they're basically drain other people of their energy with their own self-imposed misery, which makes it makes them want to be an exception because they want to show themselves as, oh, but look how much I do for this other person. And the reality is that you're actually very, very toxic to yourself and to everybody else. But you want to come across as somebody who's, look how much I've suffered and look what a good person I am anyway. Yeah, I mean, that's the other side of it. So they both come from the similar type of a place. So okay, so we have this story of Katyayani as as the Mahisasura Mardini, as the one who slays this particular demon. And now it says there's another story where she accompanies Mahalakshmi in the present-day Kolhapur town to fight demons like Kohasur and Raktabij. And now the Raktabija story we also associate with Kali, where her tongue, comes out and she drinks up the blood of Raktabija, who is the demon of the seed of desire. So in other words, when you kill Raktabij, when you kill him, his blood makes more of him. So you can never really get rid of him. The more you try to kill him, the more you just keep making hundreds of him. And it's funny because that's kind of the way addiction or, extreme desire, can work. The more you try to get rid of something, the more it just has a hold on you. So she is the demon who swallows the blood of Raktabija. So in this version, Katyayani is the deity who actually engages in this task of drinking his blood. And at that point, then she could completely destroy him. So there's this removal of desire, removal of excessive desire or desire that is actually borderlining on obsession or, something that, desire in its harmful form. We don't want to say that desire in itself is bad. Desire is a deity, is kama, right? There's nothing, and it's more than that. It's more, kama is more erotic, which has to do with more than just desire. But nonetheless, that idea for drive or desire is definitely something important and necessary. But when it becomes this kind of egoic, I need to have this, or I must, in the way that we do with addictions, or the way that someone might become obsessed with a person or an individual, you can have desire that can, get out of control when it's, out of balance in its own way. So this is about rebalancing. This is not about a battle of good versus evil. This is about, okay, this has gotten out of balance to the point that it is no longer helpful or productive, or, no longer allows the preservation of, the order of the world going round. Instead, everybody in the world is just got the foot on the neck and everybody is miserable. So this is how so the gods represent this, this liberating force from that. Okay, so we have that. Now there's one other association with Katyayani, which is really quite interesting. And this is the association with Sri Krishna. Now, let me see this. This is the, I have the story here somewhere. I just want to make sure I can find it. That's really... Okay, yeah, here it is. Sorry. The Bhagavata Purana describes the legend of Katyayani of Vrata, where young marriageable daughters, or gopis, of the cowherdmen of Gokula in Braja worshipped goddess Katyayani and took a vrata, or vow, during the entire month of Margashirsha, the first month of the winter season, to get Lord Krishna as their husband. During the month, they ate only unspiced kitri, and after bathing in the Yamuna at sunrise, made an earthen deity of the goddess Katyayani on the riverbank, and worshipped the idol with aromatic substances like sandalwood, pulp, lamps, fruit, betel nuts, newly grown leaves, fragrant garlands, and incense. And of course, there is an episode in there where Krishna, when they're all bathing in the river in the morning, goes and takes all their clothes away. But so the idea is that she is worshipped, they say worshipped as the Adi Shakti Swarup, where if you make a vow of fasting, she would give you the husband that you wished and prayed for. And so this Katyayani Vrata is made for an entire month. And, so the Yamuna or the Jamuna to bathe. Desiring to obtain Krishna, they would then worship Katyayani with incense, flour, and other items. Okay. Now, interestingly, as part of this too, she's also associated with the virgin goddess Kanyakumari, who I've talked about in another episode as well, who is an avatar of Katyayani or sometimes Parvati. And this is where you have she's very heavily associated with Durga. Kanyakumari is usually a child who is chosen to be the representation of, who's considered to be the representation of Kanyakumari. And so she's like a sacred child who's like put in a temple, and, people come to her and make offerings, and depending on the expression on her face, people accept that as a certain omen or prophecy. The Kanyakumari rituals still do go on in the southern tip of India, is what it is, the area. And again, I've done a podcast on that separately, so you might want to check that out. But okay, so what's interesting here is you have this goddess who is associated with violence, being ferocious, but she's also associated with marriage or finding, the proper husband for you. I think the connection to Krishna there is the idea of, it goes back to the idea of seeing the divinity in the other person. So when somebody comes into a Hindu household, they might be greeted with a garland or people washing their feet or something because, and they say either Namah Shivaya or Namaskar, or you'll say something, or there's this idea of, or Namaste, even that phrase has to do with the idea of I acknowledge the deity within you. So they're looking at you as though you are a visiting deity. Okay, so so there's this whole idea of the divinity. So when one talks about a woman, finding Krishna as her spouse, it's the idea of finding the ideal husband, because in many ways Krishna is represented as his Radha Krishna. Radha is his becomes his partner. That they are sort of representation of the ideal married couple in a way. So in this way, when you say these prayers and take these vows and pray to Katyayani, then you will be able to attract a Krishna for yourself, an ideal husband. And this is really interesting if we consider Katyayani's role. So we say, okay, so why? How do we connect the marriage thing with the with this idea of this goddess, this who's basically attacking demons and chopping their heads off? So because they seem like they're not that they're necessarily diametrically opposed, because there only seems to be a connection between things, but the question there becomes why. You would think of a goddess perhaps like, say, Mahalakshmi, or Kamala, who is the tantric version of of Lakshmi. Those would be deities that you would reach out to for for love and happy marriage, because Lakshmi, of course, is the spouse of Vishnu, and she is also an exemplar of the good and prosperous and auspicious Indian wife kind of thing. And really what we're talking about, because Katyayani is a manifestation of anger. Remember, she's made out of the anger of the Trideva. So why is a goddess associated with anger have to do with marriage? Now I'm reading this one piece from Gurudev Sri Ravi Shankar, and he says, Katyayani is that which is born out of the seer aspect of consciousness. That's why it has to do with the Ajna, the third eye. Katyan is seer. You become the witness. You say, I am not the body, I am not the mind, go deeper within. Yeah, and that's a traditional meditative practice where you learn to disconnect yourself from the body and the mind and learn to watch it, to detach from it. That consciousness has an intuitive ability, and this aspect is called Katyayani. He says everything that happens and unfolds before us, which is called prapancha, is not only limited to what is visible. That which is invisible and cannot be perceived by the senses is far greater than what we can ever imagine and comprehend. And that energy that sees beyond senses and knows beyond logic is Katyayani. This kind of gets into what I was saying a little bit about Tantra before, is that we have the mundane world in front of us and the rules and everything that we tend to follow as a society, and this is something that goes beyond that. And he talks about divine and demonic forces in a way for people who are more dualistic in the way that they think about it. But he says anger can be a positive or negative force. And, you can use anger, you can have righteous anger to correct a situation that is, demonstrably wrong. Okay. He says here, good anger is associated with wisdom, while bad anger with emotions and selfishness. Good anger comes from a sense of broad vision. Anger is appropriate when it's directed towards injustice and ignorance. Usually we think anger is justified and directed towards some injustice only. But if you go deeper into more subtle levels of existence, you'll find it's not really so. In such cases, anger creates a bondage for the person. The anger that arises for righteous reasons and is directed towards, he's saying, negativity and justice is represented by Devi Katyayani. Yeah, it's that anger of, it's the kind of anger we can feel when we see people who are in an oppressed situation. When we see people who are unfairly taken advantage of. When you see people who are corrupt, who just are able to, rob, steal, rape, and take advantage of, anyone. You know what I mean? And not necessarily have any consequences, or are able to, even if they do suffer consequences, you want them to suffer consequences, because you don't want this, you don't want to have to worry about being subject to this kind of behavior. Nobody should have to, right? He says, Devi Katyayani also represents anger that arises in creation to restore and revive the principles of Dharma. Okay. And I think that's where the connection is. So Devi Katyayani represents that divine principle and form of the Divine Mother, which is behind such terrible natural calamities and disasters. Okay. So again, there's this idea that natural disasters, an increase in natural disasters comes from from a dharma, from the idea that when, this disturbance, things being allowed to get out of this balance, and therefore it creates these disastrous situations. And he says, Katyayani is the divine force or principle of the unmanifest divinity that arises in the subtle layers of creation against negativity for the purpose of restoring dharma. Okay, so to me, the marriage connection there has to do with dharma, because for most people, unless they specifically have a reason to live as a brahmachari, or as live in an ashram and away from the world, most people in society, it's assumed, again, at least according to this dharmic kind of system, are usually getting married. And ideally, the person you are going to be married is somebody you are going to be in harmony with, and therefore, in thus doing so, you bring harmony to the rest of the order. Like, you don't, it's only when there's problems and discontent and so forth that can potentially have an effect that goes down through the family, and then, perhaps, down, and create adharmic situations, let's just say. Now, of course, the reality is, most people don't necessarily get on well in those kinds of circumstances. Though I have heard that there are a lot of arranged marriages that work out just fine. But, one of the things, too, you'll see is they'll have the horoscope read. You have to know, there's certain points. I think there's, I seem to remember there's something like 35 or 36 points that an astrologer looks for in the synastry between two charts to see whether or not, the couple is a match for each other. There's a lot of different match points in the horoscope to say, to look for that, the idea that they're going to be an ideal couple, that they're going to get on well together, or that, there's not going to be any fighting, cheating, problems with children, like things like that. There's certain things that are considered to be more auspicious. And, it's funny because I've been actually studying some of those things more recently, the more that I do in my private practice, do more astrological work. But that to me seems to be the connection there. The idea that, in this case, the woman in that traditional role, fulfilling her dharma as a wife, would be seeking a good husband. So therefore, Katyayani would be who she has that power of bringing dharma and of maintaining or restoring dharma. Okay, and the anger piece of it is again, it's that anger that brings about correction. So the idea here is that you pray to Katyayani to have this harmonious kind of situation. It's rather interesting. Personally, I'm not sure if she would be the one who I would choose for that, but that apparently is what the tradition is. And it goes to show you that there's not this differentiation between, well, she's a goddess created out of anger and she's violent, therefore she has nothing to do with these other things that we tend to think of, we don't tend to think of love as having to do with that. But also, on the other hand, if you think about goddesses, love goddesses in the Near East, and of course in the Mediterranean and so forth, these love goddesses are often also goddesses of violence and war. So again, there's this idea of the Shakti as being something that can be very nurturing and beneficial. Even in a goddess like Morrigan, you see it. You can see a beautiful woman who can bring abundance and prosperity, and also when that is, that when that becomes problematic, or when there's, or when her energies are rejected, how that can lead to absolute disaster. So it has to do with this proper treatment of Shakti. And again, in a proper marriage, there should be proper treatment of Shakti. Ideally, you're not talking about a union where one person should be dominating the other. There should be kind of mutual respect there. How often that really happens, I honestly don't know. Because it just seems like in every marriage there's something, But in any case, that's the story there. So I think that's where I'm going to leave off talking about Devi Katyayani. The next Navadurga would be Kalaratri, and I've already done a podcast on her, so I'm going to be skipping over her to the 8th and 9th Navadurgas, between the end of December and January. So stay tuned for those, and then we will start moving into other territory. I've had a tremendously, tremendously busy month. So, and I'm going to continue to have a tremendously busy month. So I will be, normally by now I would have released the 2023 podcast schedule, but I have not done that yet. So hopefully I will get that together before Christmas. So I want to thank you again for listening. Please check out all my work on Chthonia.net. If you would like to support my work, I do have a Patreon, patreon.com/Chthonia. And I want to thank all of you who are current supporters. You can follow me on social media at Chthonia Podcast, one word, on Instagram and Twitter, and Chthonia Podcast, 2 words, on Facebook. And of course, if you're watching on YouTube, it's just Chthonia. Thanks very much again, and till the next time.